I've got the good fortune and pleasure of serving as the 2015 Summit Panel Moderator. The title of today's panel discussion is Bolstering the Pipeline of Diverse and Effective Workforce. As we move through engaging in critical conversations about equity issues and solutions related to leveraging state agency supports and resources in teacher equity planning, and to ensure high-quality educators for all students, the purpose of the panel discussion today is to focus specifically on the pipeline of diverse and effective educators for K-12 public schools. In particular, school communities, research tells us, disproportionately experience significant disparities in access to teacher quality. Considering at the national level, students of color make up more than 40% of the public school population. In contrast, teachers of color are only 17% of the teacher workforce. The panel is comprised of educators and scholars, practitioners and researchers, representatives from state departments, university faculty, and public K-12 administrators. I'd like to go through and have each panelist introduce themselves. Addie, you can start.
Sure. My name is Dr. Addie Angelov. I'm an associate professor and chair of the Institutional Review Board at the University of Indianapolis. I'm also this year acting as visiting professor of research, evaluation, and development in the MSU of Wayne Township.
That's a great thing.
Yeah, there you go.
Good afternoon, I'm Shenia Suggs. I'm the Chief Personnel Officer for Wayne Township Schools.
My name is Hardy Murphy, and I'm on the staff of IUPUI, and I'm also the Executive Director for IUPUI.
And I'm Suzanne Zybert from the Metropolitan School District of Washington Township, where I serve as the Assistant Director of CTE and District Partnerships.
Brendan Maxcy, Associate Professor in Educational Leadership and Policy Studies. I direct IUPUI's Urban Principalship Program, as well as work as a co-principal investigator both with the Great Lakes Equity Center and the Community Self-Empowerment Program with the Belize Community Center for Education.
I just want to note in our panel, excuse me, I got caught. I just want to note that the panel is composed of various roles. We've got representation from university faculty. We've got representation from K-12 administrators, former teachers. Also dual roles of community members, parents, educators, teachers, coaches, and advocates broadly. And in composing the panel, we attempted to provide or propose a kaleidoscope-like series of backgrounds, professional and personal experiences, context, and professional identities and roles. So that was some of the thinking that was behind the composition of the panel. I'll additionally talk about, as we talk about bolstering the pipeline of diverse and effective workforce, thinking about beyond, but also including, not minimizing disparities in race, but looking at other touch points of difference or intersections of difference. So disparities that exist between educators with diverse language backgrounds and nationality compared to students that they serve, as well as race. Also, thinking about how that presents opportunities to tap maybe assets and reach resources that once weren't considered, or the ways in which the panel members are engaging and activating alternative spaces to view not the deficits of a situation or entities or people in those situations, but the assets. So I'll open up to the panel with a question, just broadly to the panel. Why is boosting the pipeline of diverse educators so important? So why is boosting the pipeline of diverse educators so important? And why not simply effective educators? Why is boosting the pipeline of diversity of educators so important? And just to the panel broadly. Brenda, do you want to start?
Yeah, I'll
with your
open up
background?
a little bit, I guess, when we're done.
Okay.
On the interview. But and I do think I appreciate the earlier discussion in terms of developing effective educators. But I think we increasingly recognize as our communities become increasingly diverse linguistically and culturally, that there are assets and attributes that teachers bring to the classroom that move beyond simply pedagogical skills that I think we recognize will enrich our schools in the same way that those communities enrich our communities. And that's has been particularly true, I think, in Indianapolis over the past decade or so, that the change in our community demographics, particularly with, and Suzanne and I have worked a little bit with the growing Burmese population in Indiana, and recognizing that those communities bring experiences, bring knowledge, and also bring a variety of languages and cultures to the schools that are very helpful, but also create additional challenges for how schools navigate and support those parents and those students that are not easily or simply delivered through a preparation program. And so finding ways to recruit from those communities, recruit individuals who have relationships from within those communities can be very helpful in terms of schools supporting not only the students, but also the parents as they're making those transitions. And I think we'll talk a little bit more about that as we move on. But I think I begin there in understanding the differences and the ways in which those differences can assist schools beyond simply pedagogy and delivering and understanding content.
Suzanne, I don't know if you want to add to that. I know that Washington Township has, just to contextualize for the audience, has seen a lot of shifts in the students that they're serving. And I mentioned earlier that of the countries of origin of the 5 largest refugee populations in Indiana, Burma is highly represented at 82.8%. And although multiple school districts within Indiana have a significant Burmese population or a significant increase, I know to Brendan's point, Washington Township and the work that you're engaged with may or may not be relevant to Brendan's comments. If you want to add.
Most definitely. You know, as a school district, we have to constantly work to remain as dynamic as the needs of our school community. And with that being said, obviously our teacher recruitment is critical. We have to build relationships with the university so that we can make sure that that training, that pre-service work is aligned with what this, someday teachers are going to need to have in the classroom. That's a critical piece. Also, the ongoing support once teachers get on board, because we definitely our goal is to hire the most effective teacher possible. And while we definitely diversify our recruitment and where we go and what we do, we also want to make sure that once we get the teachers on board, that we are helping to support them as they work to support that teaching and learning every day, to build those relationships. So there's a lot of pre-service as well as once teachers are hired, support that goes into just making sure that we keep the most highly effective teacher in front of every group of learners. Because in a district such as ours, where it is ever changing, you could have a teacher 1 year that is very successful with a group of learners, and with our ever-changing demographics and dynamics, that teacher's going to need to, continue to just foster her love of what she does through that ongoing professional development. So that ongoing piece is very, very critical in a district such as ours.
Dr. Murphy and Dr. Suggs, I wonder if you can expand on how does the State Department, or how do districts begin to engage in recruiting diverse educators, retaining diverse educators, and maybe perhaps in that response, defining how you all, organizations define what a diverse educator is.
I'd like to deal with the importance question first.
Please.
Because I do think it's important to look at it in terms of what it means to work and so the students resonate with their teaching and learning experience with the individual teacher. I also co-direct a teacher evaluation project here in Indiana called the Indiana Teacher Replacement System of Supports. It's a project to help districts develop and implement effective teacher evaluation plans. There's another aspect to this importance. That importance is the importance of the collegiality within a school. So there's a relationship between the teacher and the students, but then there's a relationship among teachers. And when you look at all of these teacher evaluation systems out there now, one of the things that they all talk about is the ability to engage students, whether or not you're engaging in culturally appropriate and effective teaching practices. And another aspect of the rubric is also to talk about collegiality, professionalism, and how you develop yourself and develop others. And if you have teachers from a variety of different backgrounds, then it's more likely that a teacher who may not have had those experiences, that knowledge, is able through a collegial relationship to develop greater sensitivity to the capabilities of the students sitting before them in diverse classrooms. One of the things I think that states could do in this process is I do think it's important in terms of the specifications for how the states monitor accountability in districts, and just carving this into a teacher evaluation process. If in fact you're talking about meeting the needs as specified in these teacher-appraisal rubrics, then the question is the data being used for something? And if the data is being used to address issues in terms of cultural awareness through professional development in public schools and in school districts, then you have a way to say to the school districts it's going to be important to develop this kind of capability in your workforce. And you do that through developing the capabilities and the people you already have, and then making sure that you recruit people to work in districts and in schools who come from those communities and that background. So that's just one strategy.
Before we move into my second question, in terms of Dr. Murphy and Dr. Suggs, would anybody like to respond to Dr. Murphy's comments about recommendations or any further suggestions to the SEA?
I also ask that people speak up just a little bit. There's some
Oh, sure.
background with the events, so it's a little bit harder to hear back.
Sure, absolutely. I would certainly agree with everything you just said. In preparing teachers for culturally diverse school districts, especially here, I'm thinking about Marion County, my school district in particular, Washington Township, that's represented in urban ed. And so I think your original question was, why is it important to boost minority teacher workforce and not just an effective teacher? And as Dr. Murphy just said, there, in terms of teacher evaluation, the rubric, there are a set of standards that certainly help support teachers in that effort and are very effective with diverse populations. What I would suggest, however, is that it also is important in our work to recruit, encourage, continue to help people who are thinking about getting into the profession, especially minority candidates, that it is a worthy endeavor, and that by creating a more diverse teaching population, we not only enrich the classrooms for kids where they can make connections when they see someone who is from a background that they come from. It may not be race, it may be a socioeconomic background that connects that child with the teacher, which I also think adds to the diversity of a teaching force. I don't think we think of that at times. So I think it's important to not lose that focus and to be intentional when we think about increasing our minority population in our teaching staff. And I think that, to add to that point, it not only helps students, but I think it creates a very diverse teaching population that enriches the culture overall for the adults that work with the children.
If I could add, from a teacher ed perspective, one of the things that I think we're seeing a lot of is, we see a lot of transition to teaching programs or a fifth-year program to learn to become a teacher. And some of the realities for that at UIndy, the majority of my candidates are first-generation scholars. And the financial reality of going to school for 4 years to get a degree and then add another fifth year to get a teaching license to then go into the workforce and make about $35,000 a year. I mean, the fiscal reality of that is extremely difficult. And, in teacher ed, we're really struggling to recruit different candidates. I mean, when we're recruiting, the School of Business is sitting there saying, that if you walk out of my program, you're going to make $115,000, you're going to make $120,000. And so one of the things that I really worry about and that I've focused a lot of work on this year is, So what are some of those entry-level ways into schools, into teaching professions, and how can we support students or community-minded individuals, service-minded individuals who want to be teachers? What do we do with that? And so one of the things that I've spent a lot of time looking at this year is the role of the paraprofessional in schools. We know that a lot of schools are moving towards hiring more and more paras because of the fiscal realities that everyone is navigating. So how can we see that role as a way to recruit people of color, people who are navigating poverty, people who may not be able to pay for 5 years at a university to become a teacher? How can we see that as an entryway into the schools? How can we see that as a position that's no longer about meeting an immediate need, but filling a long-term need? And what kind of supports and things do we need to do there? And how can we kind of reframe teacher ed to support paras? Additionally, how do we support the teachers that are currently working with paras that maybe haven't been given any kind of skill set to do that? We know in a lot of ways paras are actually working one-on-one with kids in ways that we haven't seen before. And so how do we make coming into teaching a lot easier than what it is currently becoming?
Dr. Suggs, you mentioned that diversity isn't only necessitated by race or ethnicity. And Addie, what I'm hearing is that educator isn't just defined by a classroom teacher, that there are other opportunities to view and see spaces for educators. To the panel, broadly, I want to recircle back into your thinking or your definition of what a diverse educator is in the context of this conversation to develop a pipeline and being intentional about diverse and effective educators. What does that mean to you?
I would like to start. I think, when you look at that word diversity and really defining it, we all know that it looks so many different ways when you are in an area such as Indianapolis, Indiana. With that being said, I think the critical piece that we have to look at is really recruiting those educators who truly understand how to build relationships with each and every kid that walks through their doors. So, using an example of myself as a Caucasian, leader working with a Caucasian student, it can't just be assumed that because we are both Caucasian that I will automatically be able to build relationships with that kid. We could have the same scenario with a Caucasian teacher working with an African American student. That teacher, through her ability or his ability to build relationships, truly understanding each and every learner and reaching them where they are and taking them to where they need to be. Socially, emotionally, and academically, being culturally competent is going to pay huge gains in the long run with what we're able to do in our classrooms. And so I know that was kind of a long-winded way around it, but I just felt like that critical piece is building relationships, truly understanding the school community where you are, understanding the needs, and being able to build the relationships with the kids that come through your door every single day.
Suzanne, I think that's a great point. I think with that, we know, looking at the data profiles, however, that race, linguistic background, country of origin are large, I think, opportunities for us to think about in consideration of pipeline development, how to mitigate those legacies of disproportionality or legacies of some communities not having access for whatever reason, or not necessarily staying if access is available within the profession. So in light of your advice about relationship building, what, and maybe I'll pose this question to Brendan, what are some opportunities in either the pre-service or in-service leadership development, in the field of leadership development, do you feel like are spaces or opportunities for leaders, future leaders, to really learn and develop how to lead a school, how to contribute to a conversation with other leaders within their district that you found to be really helpful, that might be good for the group to sort of at least hear and start to think about?
I think I'm going to use that and bridge back a little bit to what Hardy was saying earlier as well, in terms of the issues of thinking about diversity as an organizational quality, not simply individual quality. That I think as individuals we can have greater cultural sensitivity that can help us relationship building. But within our communities and within our schools, that moving toward a more reflective organizational composition that is consistent with those, that even around the metro area in Indianapolis, it looks quite different depending on whether you're on the east side of Indianapolis or the west side, the north side, the south side. And looking within those communities to understand what sort of talents and assets are within the community that you want to bring into the school and develop, I think is important to understand how we want to approach that. Areas that it seems like are possibilities that were spoken of earlier, and that I think IUPUI is beginning to explore, and that I think within the BCC we've thought about this as well, are paraprofessionals, those who are in some ways already coming into schools, working as instructional aides, and often, for instance, in Washington Township, that is drawing on expertise linguistically within the community. The BCC provides often some supports in a multilingual Burmese community in which there's not one language, but 5 or 6 languages that are spoken, that schools have a challenge in navigating that. So the community organization both helps to identify and that helps the district access those who can translate, but some of those members also then move into the teacher pipeline. And so take Rupa, who's one of the members of the BCC community, is also working within the township and proceeding toward becoming fully credentialed teacher. As she moves into those positions, others may move into then the paraprofessional roles. And I think for IUPUI, that demands that we think somewhat differently about our preparation models, that we often have a rather traditional model in which students are expected to come full-time during the day. I think we have to think of ways in which working professionals can access our programs on weekends, evenings, but also that reflect those talents and give credit for those assets that we want the schools to be building on as well. So in what ways does the ongoing experience of a paraprofessional in schools mirror some of the experiences we want them to be having in doing observations or working with? So I think there are a lot of opportunities, as Zadie was saying, building kind of a richer approach to preparation that is also a richer approach to our recruitment of those teachers, as well as the support of the existing teachers. And so I think there are partnerships between community organizations and schools of education and districts that I think can be more robust and not expect one of those institutions or the others to take on the full responsibilities for those. And I think we're seeing more of those, but I think we can continue to develop those.
Dr. Suggs, I'll pose, in light of Dr. Maxcy's comments, I'll pose this next question to you, particularly in helping state departments, Indiana Department of Education is there submitting their teacher equity plans this evening, I think by 11 p.m. this evening.
11:59. It is just a draft to be able to have a peer review for CCSFL. No.
Early,
No.
proactive, early submission so that you can receive feedback. And so in light of that happening, and I commend the team for pushing to get that in, to get some more feedback, to put forth a more robust plan. Dr. Suggs, what are some of the barriers that you see and opportunities to retaining a diverse group of educators? What are some of, so say that we begin to find opportunities to recruit diverse educators, and how do we begin to work, or what suggestions would you give state departments and their assistants with LEAs to help and strategies to retain?
Wow, that's a loaded question. If I had the answer. What I will say, we've kind of touched on some of those various barriers, some of those being economic barriers, opportunity barriers to be exposed to the profession in a positive way, which is why using our paraprofessionals or classroom assistants as a pipeline is a phenomenal way to attack, if you will, this issue for our school systems. And so I see those as really big barriers to bringing more candidates to the table. I would say across the board, taking out descriptors such as race and so on. Opportunities, I believe we have those, again, in those programs where people are positively exposed to our school systems and with our students and with the profession. Programs that have been going on for some time, I think, certainly need revitalization in which we introduce our young people in our systems to the profession as cadet teachers, exposing them to the opportunities that they don't even think about because they're students, they're in it. But to allow them the opportunity to see the possibilities and the possibilities for them to impact the future in such a great way, I think would boost our numbers and attract more of our young people to the profession. So I think there are opportunities right at home that we can take advantage of, home being our school districts in conjunction with the state and creating opportunities for young people and bringing more exposure to the profession.
So what about them
I'll repeat the question.
Retaining them.
So Kaylin asked, what about retaining?
Again, I personally don't see that as a question of, retaining minority candidates specifically. Strictly with an HR hat, retaining teachers, period, has become an issue. Some call it, and I don't want to be offensive, a millennial issue in terms of the way we think about professions, period, not just teaching, and about lifestyles and trying new things. And so some of that is part of the conversation. It's just interesting. I think it's evolving at this point. But in terms of teachers staying in the profession 35, 40 years, I'm seeing that dwindling. I've been in Wayne Township for 23 years. I've been doing this work for some time of that, I would say, but a lot of years. And so that has been the trend. And I really don't have the answer for that other than we have to, also in my research, help teachers feel like their work is important enough for them to stay, that they're making such an impact in the field that they feel like they're growing professionally, that they're learning right alongside the kids and becoming leaders in our profession. So we have to provide those opportunities so that teachers understand that their impact is much bigger than the four walls of that classroom. That's really, really important. So
Administrative, yes, you know, almost an administrative corporation.
that's right.
That would be something, well, because I think it's equally important, like students want the feedback from the teacher.
Mhm.
Teachers want feedback from their school administrator.
Absolutely.
Especially if they respect them.
Absolutely. And not every teacher wants to be an administrator. That is not the goal. But all of our teachers have gifts. And so as a school body, or a school system, we have to figure out ways for teachers to use those gifts in creative ways in our classrooms.
To piggyback on that, I also think it's important as a profession that we think about the ways that we've sabotaged ourselves in the last few years. And I've been working on a book, and so I was talking to several people around the state, interviewing them about best practices around marketing in schools. And I talked to a lot of people about education who are not educators. And it was the first time in a long time that I'd really gotten a very blunt smack in the face about how other people view what I would call my field, education. And I was talking to several different school leaders in different types of schools, and also different donors who are going to donate to different things. And one of the things that I have been so struck by is that people outside of education are kind of afraid to get involved at this point, because the language, the dialogue, and just I have no other word than the nastiness that has gone on between educators has really soured the taste for education for people outside of education. And in a lot of ways, while we in some ways beat up on each other, we do not understand what that has done for other people and how they view us. And so a lot of times talking to people about education, I don't want to get involved in education because if I help one of you, like if I help a Catholic school, then these other schools are going to jump on me for helping this school. And if I help this school, like at a time when we need philanthropic support more than ever, a lot of investors are telling people not to invest in education because it's a risk to your reputation. And that's a very sad commentary about where we are right now. And in some ways, helping teachers understand, I don't care where you teach, if you taught a kid to read today, you did a good thing. You should feel good about what you did today. And how do we change the narrative from being so negative to how do we get an all hands on deck? How do we get there to support each other and figure out how to move forward from somewhat of the rut that we're in? Like, I think Nicholas Kristof said of education 2 weeks ago in the New York Times that it is a bloody battlefield. And it's exhausting. And that is the reality that everyone is trying to navigate. So how do we as a field move ourselves forward and out of this space? And through that, you know, it is about recruiting teachers. It is about supporting folks as they move in our field. And those are some of the things that I also think we need to be thinking about. Additionally, just to add, I think it's also important to support teachers who have exceptionalities or differences. Some of my best special ed candidates had an IEP themselves. And their ability to walk a family through that process, to talk to a child about that, I don't think we do enough to recruit people with disabilities to become teachers. And that is a group of folks that I hope we are reaching out more towards to figure out how do we navigate that as well.
It's a very difficult, very complex challenge that we have. I actually agree with you on everything that you said in talking about how we get out of the rut, though. I do think one of the things we can do is move from the conversation of defensiveness about our outcomes to a conversation about an affirmation of the motive of those who are in public education. And that's just a subtle shift, but it is a shift that allows us to build upon topics and create a conversation that I think is energizing. And as long as we're into this debate about whether or not the test scores mean anything, if the test scores are accurate, if teachers have an impact upon test scores, if teachers have an impact upon how much of it is a teacher's responsibility versus the home versus the community. That's a conversation about debating the quality of the educational product, of whether or not we are developing people that are going to go out and be able to make contributions, positive contributions, constructive contributions to our communities and lead successful lives. There's another conversation that is about the affirmation of why people got into education, and that is why they got there. Moved into education is to make sure that those things happen. And I think we've lost sight of that. But that's because it's a very difficult and complex issue to discuss. Why? Early on in the day, and I'm going to digress a moment and go back to where it's gotten back there, the conversation that the exchange you and I had earlier. We have some stats here, and it talks about the fact that there's a disproportionate underrepresentation of teachers of color in Indiana and in other places too. But there are two questions that are begged that aren't answered. Is that because we have fewer teacher applicants, or is it because they have less chance of getting hired? And I would imagine that the answer to both of those questions is yes. But until we have data that says we actually have fewer teacher applicants, and then we also have data that says, you know what, and when they do apply, they have less of a chance of being hired, then what we're doing is talking around two very fundamental issues. And that's how people perceive opportunity unfolding in front of them as they make life choices. And if people are saying that in making a life choice to go into teaching, I'm going to have less of a chance of being hired in going from Maryville to Paoli to Fort Wayne to French Lick, then you have a different kind of problem to deal with rather than just the problem of whether or not we have enough applicants. We're having a problem of are our schools and our districts and its profession in general open and receptive to more diversity? Or is it a situational decision that really depends upon whatever crisis is at hand in a particular district, in a particular school, and the kind of energy your community brings to the table of going to the podium and speaking out to those that are there that said we don't have enough applicants? teachers. That's a reactive way to look at it rather than a proactive way that says, okay, this is our problem. Let's do something about our hiring processes to make sure there is more equity of decision-making around the table.
Yeah, and I don't think we own enough that some of this is the byproduct of DSEC, that we sent students of color into white schools, we closed black schools, we fired black teachers, and that it is even 50 years later, we still haven't figured out how
Or this
to.
special education, in some ways, is a reaction to desegregation.
Absolutely, yeah, without question. Yeah, that's why RTI is so important for the state.
One thing, and I would agree and then add to that and pick up on something that Shenia said earlier as well, and that is not simply looking at our hiring processes, but looking back into the way in which we're recruiting students, not simply at the undergraduate level, but even as high school students, as cadets, because I think that tends to have two effects. One is we begin to understand students who begin to develop commitments toward education much earlier, and may do that, as I was saying, because of challenges that they face. They may seek to remedy those by becoming active educators and doing it, or to develop an experience that they have a commitment to. I think we then begin to see folks who are committed to that process throughout, and we begin to recruit those, and they begin to see themselves differently within the school as well. A school that's recruiting students to become teachers is saying something differently to its students than those who already lower the expectations and expect them to be victims of attrition much earlier as well. And so I think when you reach out to aspiring educators in the, and at the BCC, in some ways it's done even as they're in middle school, that they're already tutoring their peers and the younger students, but developing that throughout. They have a commitment to education that goes beyond simply that this is a profession that I wish to engage in, but this is in many ways a commitment to my community, this is a commitment to the younger students in my community, and can develop that, as well as saying to those, and the students we're talking about in particular, that those things that you may think set you apart from the school, that make you different than the other students, are some of the things that we are embracing and we feel we like to develop and see those as assets, and I think that again says something different to students that we can build upon and make our lives in the hiring process much easier, because we will have a richer pool from which we can hire.
Brendan, your comment makes me think of Paulo and I had a sidebar before the panel talk, because he's sort of manning the tweeting and the communication that's going on about the summit today. And one response that he received was, it's difficult for some organizations to recruit diverse educators because of the trauma that they themselves experienced as students in the public education system, and or the sort of trauma or the experiences that they continue to receive through public experiences broadly, public systems broadly. And I just wonder, to your point, Brendan, and I love the lovely way you sort of stated that all of these opportunities of difference are really they're opportunities to really engage in what I think different folks from a variety of backgrounds can bring to bear within an organization. It's really sort of a beautiful composition of strength that those respective individuals bring. To the panel, how might we go about that line of logic in our work? How might we go about in our respective roles seeing difference as a way to support all students, seeing the kind of difference bringing to bear different varieties of assets that the organization can leverage, acknowledging that there have been legacies of distrust or of trauma that the populations, particularly around the focus in priority schools, the marginalized communities and school communities, particularly those communities that have felt the legacy of being disinvested in. With all of that in mind, where do we start? This can be very overwhelming, so what would be the suggestion of the panel? What are some ways to begin this process of thinking about viewing difference as an asset in pipeline development?
I think to build on a lot of what everyone has said here and going back to that recruitment and really building our paraprofessionals, this is going to be very long because I feel like I'm going to build upon a lot of what everybody has said, but going back to that collegiality, that support, that respect, but then also that celebration within our community. Obviously, we have to build the capacity amongst our staff, whether we're talking about our parents, our paraprofessionals, our teachers in the classroom, our administration, everybody, we all have those assets. And as we recruit different people within our schools to, bring to us that language support, we know we have to help them to learn how to teach reading, how to teach math, how to run small groups. But on the flip side, they bring so much. As we teach them about that, they are teaching us about culture and about language. But then it has to be that mutual respect and that mutual celebration and that collaboration that we're all helping one another to be the best that we can be, for the betterment of the kids. But that's not going to happen alone. I think of scenarios over the years where you have that instructional assistant who is so amazing, but just has not been able to build the support with the classroom teacher because the classroom teacher sees that person as a paraprofessional or as an instructional assistant, not as a teacher, even though that instructional assistant has many assets. And then vice versa. You have instructional assistants who know that they are being pushed into a classroom to support a teacher, whether it be a highly effective teacher or a teacher who needs, some areas of support. It has to be that ongoing respect that we're going to all get better and be the best that we can be, for the support of the students. And that's going to, all come about from that building level administrator, from your teacher leaders, and not expecting one person to do everything, because I feel like talking about just being able to retain our great teachers, so many great teachers, so many community stakeholders get burned out because we're going to them for so many things. But if we can all work to be the best that we can be and really elevate the talents that those paraprofessionals bring while we elevate their other skills through all of us learning from one another, I truly, truly believe that we can do great, great things. I feel like as I look at different people that we've recruited over time in Washington Township, whether it be through our Hispanic community, through our Bulgarian community, through our Burmese community, really bringing what assets they have and utilizing them to help us to better understand the culture, but then also helping them to better understand our culture and really helping to get that win-win. And it's critical. And I feel like when I reflect on everything we've said, I think we're all hitting on it in many, many ways with some of the characteristics that we're defining. But we have to reach out, we have to be open-minded, and we have to recruit those individuals and build them and fill those areas of weakness. Again, going back to that paraprofessional who may be able to help us from the Burmese community to better understand the culture and help to support the language. We're going to have to help them to help us to develop readers. But on the same token, as educators who may be the good reading teacher, we're going to have to be open-minded to better understand all that they're bringing to us and be receptive of that and show that mutual respect.
Can I pose the same question that I did to Suggs then? So you're saying, they get burned out or something because we're pushing so much on it. Can you expand on that a little bit?
Well, I just feel like, it goes back to, and I think, I'm sorry that I do not remember your name, your colleague right to your left, talked about that administrator feedback, whether it be, through those formal evaluations, that informal evaluations, we have to celebrate our staff of all levels, and we have to provide that feedback informally and formally. And again, build that culture of respect, that community of respect, so that everybody's getting better. And we're not just, again, looking and saying, okay, this person needs to get better. We all have areas that we can grow. And I feel like that community that you can grow through that feedback and through that celebration and through that mutual respect, will enable that to happen. And it's definitely has to be everybody working together because, when I think of instances over time of just different scenarios and situations, when I look at those of success, that's been where all those variables have been in place. And, again, I could come up and share, a few different stories over time, but I feel like as we've recruited people of different talents and skills and we've been able to retain them, it is through that culture of mutual respect, regardless of, what your status might be, if you're a certified teacher or a non-certified teacher. I can think of many, many scenarios over time now when it's been effective and when we've had to work on it. And those times when we've had to work on it has been where it hasn't been that two-way street. Putting kids first, taking what both or all parties, all stakeholders bring to the table, and getting, again, going back to what that child needs.
Do you too feel like you've had difficulty in the past few years or whatever that we've seen this greater rate of turnover? Do you feel like in Washington Township it's the same difficult?
You know, I'm going to be very honest, and I feel like our HR director would echo this. We don't lose a lot of teachers over time. Our teachers tend to stay with us. And, you know, when I think about, you know, the number of teachers, granted it may change, we may not have those teachers that retire, they may be fewer and fewer at 43 years, but when I look at the teachers that I've worked with who've retired, in my last 15 years, many of them have been there for 30 to 40 years. So that says a lot. And when I look at the, you know, teachers now that are working towards, you know, becoming that master teacher and staying, I mean, I feel very, very fortunate with where we are as a district and where we continue to go to support our teachers from the time they enter us to that point of retirement. You know, I think of a couple of teachers that I'm working with right now that have obtained their administrative licenses, and they look and say, wow, there aren't any administrative jobs in our district, that I don't want to leave the district. How else can I be a teacher leader so that I can stay in this district in hopes of being able to one day be an administrator? Or how can I leave and then possibly come back? So they really look at that big picture. I think of a teacher that, you know, we were able to recruit a couple years ago from another community and has been working for many years to try to get into the district. And now she's at that point of wanting to be an administrator. But, you know, she knows how great it is. And so, again, I'm going to speak to our district. I feel like we do a lot to support our teachers. Not that other ones don't, but we're very fortunate that we are able to maintain our teachers. And that's
May I ask a couple quick questions?
Please.
Okay. So I'm hearing this conversation about engaging community members and paraprofessionals. Just a couple of issues that I'm kind of thinking through. One, what kind of supports and development is there for teachers and how to best collaborate with these folks so that we can sort of leverage the strengths of everyone involved? And then, to what extent do the evaluation or appraisal systems for teachers allow for this? I think there's pretty strong evidence that in some cases teachers feel like the buck stops with them, and so that's going to perhaps incentivize them to clamp down and privatize more and more and control more and more without trying to reach out and collaborate. I think there's pretty strong evidence of happening with student teaching. I wonder if the same effect could carry over into trying to integrate paraprofessionals into the classroom space.
Yeah, I mean, one of the things that I've been looking at on a national level is how different school systems across the country evaluate paras, how that plays into how they evaluate what role they play in evaluating the para themselves with the principal, and then how much feedback is the principal giving to make sure that that collaboration is working. Because sometimes it becomes a power issue, right? Like there's a threat here. And other times it's a knowledge issue. But what we are seeing across the country is that paras are by far more representative of the community than certified teaching staff. And so in some ways, by supporting them, one, it needs to be systemic and institutionalized. I mean, a lot of teachers, you know, get a lot of support from individual people. But there, a lot of times, are not institutional or systemic structures set up to support, one, that relationship as well as the role of the para in the school. And so a lot of times it's about changing the climate, at seeing paras, seeing student teachers, seeing different groups. Like Wayne has an amazing host program that gets people involved from the community. But how do we do those things in ways that are beneficial to the student as well as to help the teacher grow? Like the DC Public Schools had a great program called the Pathway Program. They specifically said, this is our next generation of teachers. They're going to be paras now, and when they're ready, they'll shift. And so a lot of that is around helping support teachers in supporting paras. So I think you hit that nail right on the head. And right now, there's not a lot going on there. In my mind, paras are what you would call a blue ocean. Like there's so much work to be done in that area from lots of ways. And I see a ton of potential there for recruitment and support. But you find that paras live in the community. They went to school there. Their kids go to school there. You know, I believe in Wayne, 63% of the staff of color are paras and uncertified positions. And so in my mind, that is definitely one of the places where we need to make sure that we are building supports and we're building infrastructure and we're building systems to make that happen. And so what should you be looking for in a building walkthrough if you're a principal and you walk into a class where there are 3 or 4 adults? What should that look like? What role do teachers play in giving back data? What job should a para actually be doing and not being doing? Are we setting paras up for failure by not adequately training them for the job that they're getting? You know, what are paras saying on their exit surveys when they leave us? All of those things are extremely important. And doing that work, that's one of the reasons I love working with Wayne, is because they're very much at the forefront of moving those things forward, like asking those questions, figuring it out. According to the Indiana Principals Association, this is one of the #1 things that principals are deeply concerned about. Because if they're getting called on the carpet about something, a lot of times it was because a para was involved, they really weren't trained in what they were doing, and now we have an incident that's really was out of everyone's control. You've got a bunch of really good, well-intended people who are now sitting here with what do we do? And so in a lot of ways, as we move towards additional people in the classroom that don't necessarily go through teacher preparation programs, how can we facilitate that and support that in ways that they grow to be able to do more of that work? Does that help answer?
Yeah, I was going to add to that, because I think, well, that's true, and I'm also going to defer to Hardy, because I think in some ways he can speak more to this thing about Heather Baker's work around student teaching as well. There are a lot of conventions that we operate under in teacher preparation models, in teacher evaluation, and in some ways those become traps as well. And so as we begin to think about evaluation as being something focused on the valuing of a particular individual and their contribution to the student performance, it can become a trap in terms of thinking about how they might or might not respond to sharing the leadership of the classroom with others. At the same time, we have a major opportunity as we begin to think about evaluation in different ways. How do the issues of collegiality, how do the issues of teacher leadership, how do those build into a more differentiated model of the profession? It creates new opportunities to think of how do we grow the development and the contributions of paraprofessionals, of student teachers. Student teachers, on one hand, can become a tremendous asset to the school as they're doing that, but that can be frustrated if teachers believe it's either their score or the student teacher's development. I think those are things that as we begin to think about the ways in which we develop teachers and we evaluate teachers and we begin to develop notions of teacher leadership within that, as well as building toward administrative leadership roles as well. I think we can do different things, and I think that conversation is opening up, but I think it will lapse into, Rod, I think the direction you're heading. If we're not attentive to that, and if we don't, in this case, have a strong commitment to diversity, if we commit to diversity as a value for the school, as a value for the teacher pipeline, as a value for the community, we can think of different ways of approaching that and avoid the conventional wisdom that draws us back into conventions that we have found have not been productive over time. And those include the way in which we prepare teachers in ways that don't always lead in that direction, or in the ways in which we utilize paraprofessionals, but don't necessarily move them into the pipeline toward a professional role. So I think we can do different things, but we have to be more deliberate. Convenings like this, in which you bring state leaders together, Mr. Folks, I think help to kind of think through the conversations that are required to take a commitment and make sure that's operationalized in the way in which schools function differently and classrooms function differently in relations between schools and communities. I think this is an area that I've heard Hardy speak on, so I'm throwing it to him, but I'm not sure if he wants me to.
Well, I mean, you can throw me that ball, and maybe I'll pick up another one. Because I think that, yeah, but I do think that sometimes what happens to us in these conversations is that we start out defining a problem before you know it is morphed into another issue. So So we were talking about, I thought, we were talking about the importance of diversity in classrooms. And in some ways, we moved into the more politically acceptable problem, and that is making sure that students have, there's equity in terms of teacher effectiveness based upon student diversity. That's a different kind of issue, and in some ways, it's certainly as important, if not more important, but we defined early on that effective teacher diversity was also important because it does some things in terms of the climate of the organization, the capabilities of the organization, and in fact then improves the school experience for everyone, teachers and students. So we're talking about equity here, but the Great Lakes Equity Center is about diversity and equity, right? So now, Sarah, we've got a state equity plan, but that's about making sure that students have effective teachers. That's a different problem that's trying to be solved. So in terms of addressing this piece here about diversity and equity, it would seem to me that we feel a sense of urgency about it. I know Dr. Suggs feels a sense of urgency about it. But she operates in an environment where she has to navigate some waters that may not be as receptive to the issue of diversity and race as a conference at an institution of higher education. And I know that to be a fact because I just left that environment not too long ago. So the point then is how do we create a sense of urgency about this idea of diversity of staff along with the equitable distribution of effectiveness? So in the state plan, is there a section in there where districts are encouraged, if not held accountable, for ensuring that there is an aggressive recruitment and retention of teachers from racial, ethnic, culturally diverse backgrounds in terms of their staffing picture?
No, because when we conducted our root cause analysis with the external stakeholders, that did not come up as a root cause, and that did not come forth in strategies to be produced into this equity plan based on the data.
Now, I'm sitting there with them, and I'll let that happen. See, I mean, seriously,
And you were just one of the groups. And then we had another external stakeholder group with Teachers of the Year, Milken Educators, Rural Teacher of the Year, National Board Certified Teachers. We had higher ed there. We had Human Resources Director from one of our township schools. So we had, again,
Very representative
stakeholders, and that did not come
So
up.
here we have, under the trends, that research indicates that small but significant positive effects in academic achievement when students are assigned to race-congruent teachers. Effects are generally largest for elementary-age teachers who are classified as low performers. So, I mean, so there is some evidence out there that suggests this should be part of the root cause.
Well, so I think there's evidence out there, but in terms of our hard data collections that we have, that's not, that we don't have it, just like we don't have exit interview data,
Right.
just like we don't have climate survey data. So I think that's part of why it didn't surface. And I'm not saying that it shouldn't have, but I'm saying the data that we have, it's just not there.
So making this point, that things change when people perceive that there is this pressing need for them to change, right? And I'm talking about the diversity of the teaching staff, right? So how then do we create this this sense of urgency? So because what we're struggling with now is the moral imperative of equal opportunity versus the legislative imperative of demanded outcomes and changes in our hiring and retention of teachers. Those are two very different ways to go about solving the problem. One relies upon the goodness in the hearts of people. The other one is that people want to make sure that they're complying with regulations. That's all I'm saying is that in terms of wrestling with this issue here, we got to come to grips with exactly what it is that we are wrestling with and how we want to change it.
I have a lot of things in my head right now. One is the point you raised earlier, Harvey, which is that there are instances where racial minority candidates are willing and able in many ways to serve as educators and who are, there are gatekeeping functions around that at the doors of systems that are not being examined in our conversations nor in our research. That I'm sure that we can all comment on those in different ways from our own sociocultural locations as well as observations that we make. Second, we do have data that show that we have, at least, not in the way that you talked about in proportion to other professions or candidates, potential teaching candidates of color, but in relationship to the population, overall population. And as we compare percentages of white teachers in relationship to overall population, there are data around disparities in relationship to that. When we often, though, when we're talking about effective, without talking about race, without explicitly talking about ability, income, etc., we can, it's an easier conversation to have when we talk about effectiveness, but we just spent the whole morning troubling what we mean by effective. When we raise issues around some of the ways that effective is currently being defined, that leave out attention to relationships, that leave out attention to collegiality, that leave out attention to connections with communities and families, and all of those kinds of things. So we do see race at the center of this, or at the very least intertwined in this conversation. I like the point that you're raising around to what extent is this an issue of equal opportunity or even saying affirmative action, rather than approach state equity plans as race neutral or other forms of neutrality. In what ways are states actually engaging in discussions around race and other sociocultural markers that we do have relationships with teaching and learning and outcome and how effectiveness is being defined. So these are just some thoughts I'm having as I'm listening to this, but there are choices that SEAs have right now in relationship to how they're interpreting and how they're making decisions around framing race in relationship to diversity within state educated plans that I'd like us to spend some time on.
So when you say that and you say we do have this data, we do have this research that says this is there are disparities in representation in terms of our educators and whatnot. I know we don't have it. What research can you share with us that is Indiana specific that also incorporates our other definitions that we're looking at, inexperienced, out of field, unqualified, or effectiveness ratings? Maybe there's something that is missing from our data set. So far as I understand, that's not something that we have. We don't explicitly have any, we have race is reported, for example, with our SPNs and whatnot, but from what we've looked at in terms of, or Tara, you can speak to this because really Tara pulls it for us, looked at our, help me here, we looked at our educator demographics, these were things that we did actually, in fact, we poured over data and seen, where are there gaps and where are there maybe not so many gaps. And I just don't know. I also, in terms of, and maybe Monica, you can speak to this, in terms of what's required of us and what we're supposed to be looking at for distribution of effective educators, where does that fit in? And maybe you can speak to what other states have done to, in terms of...
You just articulated what the big problem is. Because the big problem is you guys are responding to this new direction. And I've not seen what the federal requirements are, but I doubt very seriously if the federal requirements address the problem in this way. So you are responding to the requirements of the federal document. Mm-hmm. But it kind of goes back to the point that was made earlier. Dr. Angela, am I saying your name correctly? She talked about how people don't want to talk about have this conversation about public education. Part of that is because the minute you bring it up, inevitably somebody on the other side of the equation that's outside the profession says, well, you guys just don't want to be held accountable. Right. So similarly, when you have a conversation where you're talking about race and ethnicity, the first thing that people say is, well, okay, there you go playing the race card again. So both of those conversations get shut down, and you don't come up with any meaningful solutions because people have a hard time internalizing their part in the solution. So just as people outside of the profession have some responsibility in being a part of the solution for improving public education, people outside of people who are not of a racial, ethnic, cultural group have some responsibility in looking inside of themselves and saying, you know, there's a point that's being made here that I should be at least receptive to. And a lot of it has to do with the fact that people feel like we're in post-racial society because of the president.
One
And it
data
does.
source I would say would be, and I can certainly do some more work around this to excavate some things, but there's certainly quite a bit of data in relationship to teacher rates and percentages of students of color in special education. And if we, rather than viewing special education as an indicator of more kids with disabilities and rather as some folks call it, you know, the canary in the coal mine scenario where there's an indication that there are a lot of structural and individual factors that come to bear in students being placed in not just more special education programs, but segregated environments. And there are Indiana data that indicate students of color, the most recent data I've looked at, tend to be in segregated placements with the same disability labels in Indiana. 70 or 80% of students of color tend to be segregated over 80% of their school day versus about 20% of white students with the same disability labels. So those kinds of data do exist, and there have been relationships made between the race of practitioners in those kinds of sites and disproportionate representation.
And that data for Indiana exists. Like if
So
you
I
want to know
understand that data
Special ed
exists in terms
stuff
of
is
the
there without
students
question.
and the
Yeah.
SED, but I'm wondering in terms of the educators, really that's what the equity plan is about. It's about the educators and not necessarily, that's not to say that it's not hopefully going to impact them and through our work with RTI and whatnot, we're intending to sort of look at that piece where we have this disproportionality of identified, particularly African American males, for example, in special ed, right? There's over-identification, or even language minority students, right? We know that that data exists, but the data that we're looking for is what says that, so, and you're referring to this research, and again, I would so appreciate the big pass bill. What says that, or what shows that in Indiana we have this issue of white teachers teaching minority students are not as effective as minority teachers teaching minority students?
Well, I think some of that is the way that data has been disaggregated historically. So like if you look at the disproportionality data,
That's what I
they
mean.
have been getting at it through academics and through discipline. So you can see it, so like the way you're asking the question, you need to realize that the data that you're going to see is going to identify, and anybody else can jump in, but it's going to identify effectiveness based on discipline data and academic data. So you're going to have to decide, like around effectiveness, like, you know, are these students growing academically, or are they referring way too many kids to the office, or what is the validity of their referrals? What are those kind of issues? So instead of lumping it all together and saying effective, it's been disaggregated based on academic achievement and